2 of the Five Thread podcast, we have a special bonus episode with Sam Taylor. Sam is the founder of The Good Factory and describes herself as a future-centric thought leader, specialising in the delivery of circular and social compliance goals across the sustainable fashion industry. As a third-generation garment producer, she understands the realities of the sportswear industry, and in this episode speaks frankly about the challenges that lie ahead. This episode is split into 2 parts. In the first part, we focus on sportswear, specifically extending product life, and the myths around reuse and recycling. In part 2, we dive into the challenges of the fashion and clothing industry as a whole, from ethical working practices to the race for ever higher profit margins. I also asked Sam what keeps her motivated and continuing to work in sustainability despite these challenges. I've got to know Sam over the past year, and I'm always struck by her depth of knowledge in sportswear and also her straightforward honesty, both of which come across in this episode. Welcome to the Five Thread podcast. Today I'm super excited to have Samantha Taylor join us. So Sam, I thought we'd start if you could introduce yourself.
Yes, thanks. It's really great to be here. Thank you for having me. So I am Sam Taylor. I am a third generation garment producer. So I have grown up in the clothing industry from the factory floor, before child labour laws were a thing. My entire family have sort of worked around sportswear and intimate apparel for generations. So I sort of fell into this business. And from there, I worked at Wiggle for 5 years, which I loved as part of my career. And that sort of was my real push into sportswear and sort of my own right. And then just before lockdown, I started The Good Factory because we wanted to specialise in helping sports businesses transition into a green economy, circularity, good production practices, ethical production practices, good product development, and an end-of-life plan for those clothing. And that's where, that has brought me to today. And I've worked with lots of businesses globally. We've obviously had to move into a little bit more of the legislation based side of it, just with all the green deals that are happening globally. So we work with all sorts of businesses from cycling, equestrian to wetsuits, advising not only just on the production but product development to ensure longevity and ensure it can be used again. Sort of best practices within the industry.
And this is exactly why I wanted to speak to you today, because of your honesty, but you just cut through a lot of the myths and the BS that is out there right now, because I do think at the moment there is just a lot of pseudo truths. There's terminology that is just bandied about, that's misused. We're going to dig into all that today. And I wanted to dig into your kind of specialist expertise on sportswear, given it's such a performance product and the materials needed for that product are quite specific. Do you see that sportswear could lead in changing that supply chain?
I definitely do. So I think sportswear actually leads the way in sustainable material innovation, new ways, as well as just actually even having that baseline level, because we sit around and we talk about how do we ensure this performs and how do we ensure it's durable, which I think is the very first key point, isn't it, when you're talking about sustainable products? It's how do we keep this be in use as long as possible? And a lot of that comes from a protection point of view. But I think that plays really, really well. And then obviously, we are really huge actually in next gen materials. If you go to Performance Days or ISPO, the level of sort of newness and the conversations around sustainability is a lot bigger than when you get at the fashion show, like the fashion ones.
And do you think the way that we now consume sportswear, because we seem to really kind of transition into the fact that, we're comfortable wearing athleisure since COVID and we become much more casual, we kind of consume it now more like a fashion product. And do you think that's changed the supply chain in terms of, we have to make it faster because even though it's performance, it still has to be on trend. And we've also got to compete on a price level. Do you think kind of COVID and that shift in customer perceptions changed it for the better or not?
I have seen it in some instances. Like I've seen sportswear businesses push designs that are very of the moment, and they very much go into sale quite quickly. They do not have full price sell through. It will often be there for quite a long time. So I do think sportswear has a tendency to be a bit more savvy in that sense because they've got that performance aspect. But saying that, so obviously very sad that Wiggle, yeah, ended, shall we say? And it's technically still running under Mike Ashley, but for all intents and purposes, it ended. Because they had a lot, and they made actually a lot of money through their data. And data is king. It's why Shein does so well. It's data, data, data. And they would sell that to brands. So they had such a brilliant picture of the people that shopped at Wiggle. But everything was always done from how do we serve the customer? How do we serve them? And there were so many passionate people there who were all about serving that customer. So yes, it's obviously we want them to spend money, but it was about ensuring that we served them and they came back. Like the customer service at Wiggle, I promise you, was second to none. As somebody who used to be hounded by them for questions, their customer service was second to none as well. So it was so human focused in that sense. And I don't know what effect on the industry, or certainly the cycling and tri-sports industry, what that will have with brands not being able to have access to that data. Because I think that's key. And that drives a lot of decisions. But generally, I think the industry to date has pushed back on that fashion level just because we have a lot of data around our customers, and we want to ensure, everything is so well tested within sportswear. And I don't think anyone will ever give that up if they're true sports professionals.
I do think, the testing and the due diligence that goes into a performance sports product, and I think there's a difference between athleisure and a product that you buy for performance, is night and day. And the tests, most people won't know, but they're so expensive and they happen behind the scenes to ensure that you're creating a product that can really deliver when you need it. And before you talked about durability, and these products that we're making, they are designed to last. And what I see is a lot of people getting into certain sports and buying these products, but treating them more like a fashion item where they will wear them for maybe a couple of months and then they'll want something new. They'll want the latest jacket. And, I see within sport that there's a lot of focus on sport now taking a responsibility for its impact. A lot of that is coming through things like efficiencies in stadiums or fan travel. And very few people are talking about the impact of sports apparel. And I feel like sports itself is responsible for a lot of apparel, but also if you are partaking in sports, by necessity, you end up buying sports apparel. And so a lot of people now have talked about this idea of, well, we're just going to recycle it. We're going to work with recycling partners, or we'll recycle it to grassroots sport and we'll ensure it's passed down. And I wanted to talk to you because I know you're going to kind of bust these myths around exactly what that means and the difference between things like reuse and recycling, because we aren't recycling our way out of the volume of performance sportswear. But I thought maybe you can kind of talk us through exactly what that situation looks like.
So, recycling our way out of the climate crisis is such a 90s idea. And you think in 2020, we should really have come up with something better, shouldn't we? It's super interesting. So we actually had an EU Horizon funded project a couple of years ago now with some partners for the mechanical recycling of bio-based polyamide. And it becomes really tricky. And I think part of the reason it becomes tricky is almost because of legislation. So you've got the EU's Green Deal, and they're either pushing recycling or bio-based. But the problem is you can't currently recycle bio-based because it's not a drop-in solution. So that's that's a net zero. That's a net zero target, is that one, because of our for almost, not using fossil fuels in that sense. So that's almost a separate issue or a separate thing that we have to look at. And then you've got recycling, which will not help us achieve net zero, but does fall into that circular action plan. And I think we have to sort of separate those two out. And it's really interesting. So I think coming back to reuse, which I think is, again, like you said, really important. It goes into that durability conversation, and is the fact it has to be better. I mean, I've seen on your Instagram, all the football shirts that have been ripped and torn, and you're just like, what happened there? If it's not good enough for the first game, it's not going to be good enough at the 100 game. But also, is there enough people to reuse all this product that we're creating? Population-wise, particularly in Western Europe, our populations is decreasing. So if we've got all this waste, we're not reproducing enough people to use it all. So, I mean, that's our first problem, isn't it, really? And then you go into recycling, and there's a lot to be said for it, I think. But the majority of recycling is mechanical recycled. And how that's done depends on your feedstock. But, for all intents and purposes, we'll say polyester because it's, a large proportion of like our clothing and most of sports. In order for it to be mechanically recycled, it can't have trims on it, or the trims have to be the same. So because the absolute biggest cost that we just cannot quantify within recycling is sorting. So it's a lot easier to recycle a 100% polyester t-shirt, providing it's got the 100% polyester sewing threads, doesn't have any additional trims, the care label's 100% polyester. We can probably get rid of some of the heat transfers, but the more stuff you put on it, the harder it is to recycle. And then you kind of go down a mechanical route, but it will degrade over time. And to be a fiber, because some of them are unbelievably thin, to ensure that durability, it has to be blended with virgin fibers. And the level of that depends on multiple factors. But it also then has to be sorted into, color and everything else. So now you hear a lot more about chemical recycling, and now everyone's got their own chemical recycling scheme. I think Lululemon's is just genius from a business perspective, but that's wholly greenwashing. And the problem with chemical recycling is that ultimately there are chemicals involved. Even if it's enzyme treated, which Lululemon's is, it still creates chemical waste through stripping out of the color, stripping out any finishes, switching out any additives, and that becomes what the industry calls slurry. Now, you can't dispose of slurry because each vat, you don't know what's in it. I'm just going to use Lululemon as an example, because I know like every big sports brand has its own initiative, but I think Lululemon's was quite clever because a couple of years ago we'll go with unsubstantiated rumors that they were sat on more stock than the company was valued at, which I now believe to be fully true after this announcement, because all of a sudden, they turn around and just be like, yeah, we've done this, all mechanical recycling trials, and you need thousands of tons of waste to get to where they have been through various trials. And then you look at how much tax they're paying, barely no tax last year, because they've basically written it off through R&D schemes, which is why I think it's genius from a business perspective, because they've taken their excess stock, they've created their own chemical recycling. Now they've got a feedstock route, which I think is very clever. Again, purely from a business perspective. In terms of a sustainability perspective, it would still have been better to have not made that stuff in the first place. Anything that we recycle without it going into a consumer's hands is it. It's wasted carbon, it's wasted water, it's wasted chemicals. That is literally the terminology of destroying our planet. And then I'm the one thing that I've not kind of been able to get into the bottom of is how they plan on doing the sorting. So, you're talking about consumer end of life. You're sticking this plant in one country, but you've got a global footprint. How are you getting that over borders? We've got all sorts of problems with that, particularly when you then look at legislation. Europe doesn't want it to leave Europe, although technically we can ship secondhand clothes, but you can't ship rags. That's actually always been the case. So although we sit around and talk about, this waste isn't going to go, that's always been the case. We just having a re-conversation about it. So I don't, it's one of those things where I'm like, it's 100% greenwashing in that instance, but it was very clever from a financial point of view, and to then have all this marketing. But the other good thing that I think will come out of it, because they've done this for polyamide 6,6, is that is a fibre that we don't actually have a lot of. So there's a very small amount within the industry. So what they're doing is they are also aware, like long term, that there is going to be more of a stretch on this. It's going to become harder to source. So now they've got control of their own feedstock systems, which is bad for smaller businesses. And that's kind of something that I see across the board, and it does worry me with big sports brands when they come in with their own recycling. They are controlling the supply of their own feedstocks, and it's it's a bit of a monopoly base, isn't it? And that isn't good for anybody.
And potentially a bit of an excuse to overproduce. That's also what I'm seeing. And some of the stats that I always kind of refer back to, and again, please share it if any of these are untrue, only about 1% of used textiles go back into making new textiles or clothing. So this idea that we are recycling at scale isn't true. It's still very, very small. And of that 1%, the majority will be a polyester, because that's really what we can commercially recycle at scale. And it's a polyester garment without any trims. So ideally with no prints, no zips. So your kind of basic polyester t-shirt. And, if you think about how many garments are actually a basic polyester t-shirt, not very many. Yes, there's more in sportswear, but we tend to, upvalue our products by adding all these different things to add value to the customer. And then be like, okay, well, now we need to make it into a mono material so we can recycle it. But I think it's just really important to kind of bust that myth of, yes, this is being recycled, because it's not, and that's a fact. And we do see that companies are investing in recycling logistics, but these tend to be pre-consumer waste, which is stuff that has never made it to the customer. It's overproduction, and essentially it's new garments that have been made and are just being recycled, because after it's been to the first customer, you do get into these sorting logistics where if you give it to a charity shop or you donate it, that will kind of be put on a conveyor belt with things which are cotton, mixed blends. And so how do you even start to decipher what is just a polyester garment and extract that so it can go into the recycling infrastructure? And I don't think the average customer, me being the average customer, is aware of that. I think we just think it's a much easier and straightforward process. And what I see is a lot of stuff is reused. And we like to believe that that's a good thing, where we're going to kind of reuse it in the local community. But most of this is shipped overseas into third markets, and it's flooding those markets with the volume of stuff just becoming unmanageable, and it is polluting their waterways, and their environment. Do you feel like most people are aware of that? I guess my question is, do you feel brands use this lack of knowledge to their advantage, and there is clear greenwashing happening because we don't understand the complexities of recycling?
To a point, yes. But I would also say I think that in a lot of cases, people in the brands have got no idea that happens either. Because I think particularly people that work from middle management down now do not get enough time, enough investment in order to make those discoveries themselves. So I which I think has been a byproduct of that push on price and margin, and the dividends, the dividends for shareholders, of which everybody is part of. Particularly we look at stock buybacks. Every single sportswear brand is doing a stock buyback. And before 71, that was illegal because it was market manipulation, and it's still market manipulation. And so that sort of drives the conversation, I think, forward, because people don't have that information. Because I generally do think most people are good and don't want to do that, but they just aren't aware. And it's really interesting because I think then, and this is going to be a bit controversial, but I think charity shops
do it. This is why you're here.
I think charity shops sometimes play into that as well, because we've got this idea that they're the good guys, and I'm not convinced, which is not a bad thing. I think what I'm trying to say is, charity shops want you to donate to them, so they, that's a good thing that you do. So you stick all your stuff that you don't want anymore into a charity bag, thinking that somebody else is going to want it. But if you don't want it, why would somebody else want it? Like, what decision was made in that instance? And then it goes to the charity shop. And bearing in mind, more than 35% is then sold. Is not sold to a consumer, it's sold to waste businesses. And it's those businesses that then send it abroad. But it's kind of like everyone in the chain is just going, oh, it's not my problem. Whereas I think and I do think that charity shops have the potential to be at the forefront of change within this, because they're literally the sorters. They're already sorting. How we aren't giving them further investment in order to do this, I just think that's a much better way, rather than dropping 5 million to the Salvation Army's new sorting facility. Why couldn't that have been distributed to local hubs, and then to have done that instead on a human basis? Because there's no technology that you can then scan and it sorts out via its system. And actually, a study was done several years ago that says that we can only determine when elastane is present in a garment at 6%. After that, we don't know. And so we've sort of took that within the Good Factory, and we're like, basically 10% is your minimum elastane that you should be using. And you shouldn't be using it in t-shirts. There's no reason for it to be used in t-shirts. But the minimum we will use is 10%, so that you know, everybody can pull it and go, yeah, that's got elastane in. And yeah, so I think that's sort of my controversial opinion in that sense, is we're feeding this beast effectively.
Yeah, and I wonder whether we're doing that to make ourselves feel better. It's a lovely thing to be like, I'm going to take this to a charity shop and somebody else will continue this life and it's not my responsibility. But I think most people will be shocked to think, actually, the majority of stuff given to a charity shop doesn't get sold within your local community. It's sold as a commodity, as textile,
Yeah.
waste, feedstock, goods, but it's often going to another part of the world, you know, and there isn't that transparency from charity shops showing us actually this is what's happening. You know, we're kind of creating this myth for ourselves. You know, and I don't think it's with anybody's KPIs who are working in the commercial side of the businesses to really be aware of what's happening in terms of that supply chain. A lot of KPIs, if you're a buyer, if you're a merchandiser, are just about profit and selling more, you know, and almost knowing what happens in the industry can become a really hard conflict of interest. And I think as I've seen a lot of my peers go through, you know, being buyers when they're in their 20s, they now come out of the business and go, I've realized what I've done. Like, I've realized the impact that I was part of. And I think we're seeing that more and more.